Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside ArtScroll, where the books you read and the people who write them come to life. Today I am privileged to be joined by Rabbi Dovid Greenblatt and Mrs. Debbie Greenblatt, son and daughter-in-law of Rav Nota Greenblatt, about whom ArtScroll has just released a brand new biography. So thank you, Rabbi and Mrs. Greenblatt, for coming out here to ArtScroll to talk about the new book and to talk about your father and father-in-law, respectively. Really an amazing human being, and I'm excited to hear your personal reminiscences of his life. And again, thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Rav Hissiger. It's a pleasure to be at ArtScroll, and we can't think of a better way to spread his message. My father was humble and private, but he wanted the world to learn, and he wanted the world to grow, and he wanted people to, teaching Torah was, he went to Memphis, Tennessee to start a day school when no one else would sacrifice such a commitment.
Something you mentioned, he was humble and he was private.
Yes.
Which is interesting. What do you think his reaction would be if he would see that there's a biography about him?
He would say, "Why are they wasting their time? What they have nothing to write about? Like why?"
And he had a great sense of humor.
Oh, he had a great sense of humor. He would say, "This is an Irish guy." He would say to him, "This was like, these weren't the things." A humble person means that it means that there are things of greater value. There's something more important than me, and therefore, a book about me, like, why would that be important to anybody? Right. A person, And that's how he lived. He didn't, it made him approachable because things that makes people difficult to approach is because they have kind of a shield. They're not humble, they're always protecting themselves. He didn't protect himself. Right. He was open.
Part of it is being an open book, and Shmuel Batnick, the author, who just did a magnificent job on this, brings it out in such an eloquent way, is that Rabbi Greenblatt was an original. He was original. He was unlike any other. I was asking Shmuel Batnick, who could you compare him to now that you've done years of research? He said, you can't think of anyone else like Rav Nota Greenblatt. Just a yachid b'minai. Talk about that.
I remember the first time that I met him. So we had just become engaged, and I had heard about Rav Nota, and we were going to meet. I don't know if it's still there. There was a restaurant in Williamsburg called Gottlieb's.
Of course, sure.
And I had never heard of it, really, coming from Far Rockaway. And I expected to meet this man with a big brimmed black felt hat and a dark suit and a white shirt. And in walks a man with a light colored jacket and a colored shirt. And that was amazing. But everything he said was Torah-dic. There was nothing that he said. There was no chit-chat. Everything that he said, he was warm, he was engaging, he was welcoming, but everything that he said was completely Torah-dic. It's like the Torah flowed through him. Mm-hmm. So it really didn't matter to him at all, I don't think, like what the wrapping was. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that it was a way of respecting my mother-in-law, that she was born in Memphis, Tennessee. Uh-huh. Her mother was born in Memphis, Tennessee. And I think that he just respected her, and he just let her shop for him. Mm-hmm. And it didn't really matter.
I was going to ask you, I don't want to focus so much on the externals because it really doesn't matter, especially Rav Nota showed us that how little the externals matter. But people are curious because they see pictures, they see videos. If people met him in person, I remember seeing him by several weddings, and I was always intrigued by this personality. But what was it on purpose? The straw hat, the light suit, the colored shirt, which is so atypical for an Adam Gadol. He was a gadol b'Torah. He was a baki nifla. Again, this is from reading in the book and hearing so much about him. Someone who spoke Nashim Nezikim with the Briskerov and Reb Moshe and Gedolei Adar. He was able to converse with them with ease in any part of Shas and so on and so forth. So how do you explain that exterior? What would you
I'll answer that. I'll try to answer it. I'll just tell you, this story happened a couple of days ago, so it won't be in the book, unfortunately. But a fellow said to me, he was a young man in Staten Island. He was sitting in the base medrash, and Rav Moshe would spend time there, of course, because Rav Reuven was there. And he says he's sitting in the base medrash one day, and in comes a man in a short coat with a straw hat and a clean-shaven fellow. And he looks at him. He doesn't know who he is. And he walks over to Rav Moshe, and him and Rav Moshe talk for 20 minutes, and it's ferocious. It's like Torah didn't talk, and it was, they were working through something difficult. And afterwards, he didn't know it was my father. My father walked away, and he goes up to here, and he hears Rav Moshe tell Rav Reuven, and he says, "Oh, das a given Geschmack." That was Geschmack. I can't. How do you explain it? I think that, his father was a chashuv yid. He had also started the first day school in Newark. The Talmud Torah had been the 15 shuls had Talmud Torahs, and that was the way of supporting the shul. And it was a process, and that was a successful, entrepreneurship was that the shul had income from this. But my grandfather saw that there won't be a hemshech from this because, as we all know, the Talmud Torah movement goes up till the bar mitzvah, whatever, and then my grandfather started the first day school, which is still around. I think it's the Kushner Academy today. I think it's been renamed several times, but that was because he felt that if we're going to have a hemshech in Torah and there's going to be something meaningful, we have to have a day school. My father, a humble person and a private person can have his own world, and you need your own world if you want to. The world we're in is hard. There's a lot of noise there. There's a lot of challenges. Every one of us battles all of them, and there's certainly even more today than there would have been 5 or 10 years ago, maybe. But my father lived in his world, and his world was a world of Torah. It was a world of achrayus. It was a world of what would HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from me. It was a private world. He wouldn't tell you any of this, but you could see that, so it didn't matter where he was, whether he was on a train or a bus, or he was in the Rambam's world. He was in Rashi's world. He was, I think, the story might be in the book that someone called him and said, "Today's Rashi's yard site," and my father said, "He died." And so his world was one of Rashi and the Rambam, and of Torah and of achrayus, and therefore humility lets you do that because. It lets you do that, and it also lets you think in Torah. Rav Wolbe has a sefer called Kinyan Torah, I think it's called, and he talks about how we should think in Torah. So if you see a car wreck, you should say, is he a mazik? Is it grumma? Is it garmi? What kind of damage was
everything
this?
Through the prism of Torah.
My father saw everything through the prism of Torah. I don't know if there's this may or may not. But I remember I was sitting in Memphis. I was a child. I don't think it's in the book. And my mother, who is a regular Memphis woman, reads the newspaper and says to my father, she says, "So-and-so family just married a non-Jew. They married a shiksa." And I'm between my mother and my father, and he says, "Kedushin is not typhus with a shiksa. You can't marry a shiksa." Which is, and I'm looking at the two, and I said, here's a yid, he's living in the Mishnah and Kedushin, you know what I mean? He's living in the fact that that's a perspective, that's the perspective of Torah, of how, we look at Rahman
I think the reason why, what I was talking about the externals, the reason why it's so refreshing is because we live in a world, and I'm not taking a stance on this, for better or for worse, there's a tremendous amount of importance and stress placed on conformity. Right, everyone has to conform. No one wants to be too much out of the box. You don't want to be called a free thinker because then you're like out of the mainstream. Your father didn't seem to care much about that. Like you said, he cared about Torah learning, Torah living, what he could do for Hashem, what he could do for others, and everything else. It wasn't even secondary. It was just not. It wasn't right. It wasn't.
It was
even
from
real.
His youth, because here's a person he was a ben bias by Rav Moshe, in the letters to my father, and I think one or two might be in the book, it says, Ohov kibni. And I know when I would go after I grew up, I'd go with my father to Rav Moshe. When he came to the door, the Rebbitz and Rav Moshe, not to hear, the excitement was mamish like a son came back to visit, And yet he packed up and moved to Memphis as a bacher, left that world, and took a bus to Memphis, Tennessee, to take a job in a Talmud Torah because he wanted to teach Torah, and he felt that he would use his kashrus for that. I think in a lot of ways he turned down shidduchim, as any successful ben Torah has opportunities for shidduchim. It was no different then. And he turned down opportunities because he wanted to be able to go into travel. He would not be able to do that if you marry a daughter of Rosh Yeshiva. You're in the yeshiva,
You wanted that freedom?
Yeah, oh yeah. He would mockingly say all the time, I made that guy Rosh Yeshiva, I made that guy Rosh Yeshiva. And I said, we made Rosh Yeshiva. He said, they came, the Rosh Yeshiva offered me their daughter, the Rosh Yeshiva. And I said, no, not for me, but take Yankel, take Chaim, take Veril. And they ended up becoming the Rosh Yeshiva today, understandably, in this kindness. But so he turned down opportunity. But so this focus on what Hashem would want from me, and a lack of concern about conformity, was really when he was started from his youth. He attached to Gedolim. He loved the opportunity to talk.
Well, by the way, on that topic, speaking, he loved Gedolim. He loved Gedolei Torah. Talk about the fact that he lived in a relative midbar for decades. It wasn't like he was surrounded by yeshivas and by Bnei Torah who he loved. I remember seeing when he would come to Lakewood, any time he was in Lakewood, the Bnei Torah would flock to him and they would surround him, whether it was by a simcha or anywhere else. He was like a magnet. But in Memphis, he didn't have that. But somehow his fire kept burning. What do you think was the secret behind it?
I think that he enjoyed it so much, but that was a personal enjoyment. Mm. And I think that he was a man with a mission. And so anytime he had the opportunity to go to Lakewood, or if B'nai Torah came home ben Hazmanim and he could give a share on Chol Hamoed Pesach or Chol Hamoed Sukkos, you could see that he just loved it. I mean, he just thrived on it. But there wasn't room for that, because if you're on a mission, then you're on a mission and you just have to do your mission. Mm. So I think that there was very little in my father-in-law's life that was about him. I think he was like the vessel through which Hashem flowed in this world. Hashem's Torah, Hashem's Chesed flowed in this world. The last few years, my youngest brother-in-law, Yoel, my in-laws were Lavdu and Chaim L'Chaim, already older. They were a little bit home, a little bit more. And my brother-in-law would get my father-in-law to tell stories. So, you ask a person to tell a story. And they start with, well, when I was in Las Vegas, and they tell you the story. He never started a story like that. His stories was, there was a yid that needed a get, right? So there was very little of the I there. Mm-hmm. So even like being willing to exile himself to a veritable midbar. I mean, Memphis is a great place.
Right.
And, but there's it's not Lakewood by any standard. I think he was a man with a mission. And I think that I never met my father-in-law of Shalom's father, Yitzchak Greenblatt. I'll just tell you a cute aside that my father-in-law for many years was a Moel. Mm-hmm. So my husband David is his oldest son, and my first child was a boy, and it was Shabbos in Far Rockaway before there was an Erev. So the bris had to be wherever the mother and the baby was. Mm. And it was in my parents, Aleim Mashalem's home in Far Rockaway. And when it came time to name the baby, usually the Moel turns to the father. But maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but he just named the baby after his father.
His father, he didn't even ask you?
My eldest. So I have to say that my guess is, though I never met my father-in-law's father, that it was a family with an independent streak. Mm-hmm. I would say that all of the children have an independent streak. So my guess is that it didn't start with my father-in-law. He might have brought it forward quite a bit, but it probably didn't start with him.
Right.
What would you say, David?
I would agree, but I think that it allows a person to conformity stops us from becoming the best that we can become.
Yeah,
we waste our cycles on trying to make sure and doing whether we're conforming or not. And if you can shed that, you can say, well, I have to be the best I can with the Kalim HaKadosh Baruch Hu blessed me with.
Right.
And
it's not about what other people will say, it's about what their Rebbeinu Shalom will say. That's what he lived. That's what he lived with. And I think only someone with that attitude, like you were saying, could do what he did, which is fly millions of miles all over the world at his own expense for the most part to help people, whether it was for gitten or other things. The stories are in the book, stories that have been told many, many times, some more famous, some less famous. And the author was telling me some stories that are not in the book as well. And he mentioned as well to me that your father kept a meticulous accounting of all his travels. Do you still have that?
I have it all.
All his plane tickets
Ticket.
and hotel stays and rent-a-cars and so on and so forth. Everything is there for posterity, or like I told Shmuel, his tickets to Gan Eden of the people he helped. I think someone can only do that if they don't have a personal agenda. Right?
I have to go through the million tickets because he also wrote Torah on the back of them. If he would have a thought in Kodshim, he would write it in the back of the airplane ticket, and it's in there, and I've got to go through them, which is you're talking, I don't know, thousands of airplane tickets and stuff that are a lot, and he would put his Torah there when he would have a machshava, because he in fact he felt that he would sometimes take long bus trips because he could sit and learn. Mm-hmm. And he was in his own world there, and he could do it for hours. And as far as being alone in Memphis and missing the world of Torah, he had it in Memphis because he had the Rambam there and he had Rashi there, and if you watched him, you see he was living with them. And there was, yes, it's not the same as the give and take of the Lakewood Beis Medrash, any Beis Medrash, but that was his, that was the world he lived in. It was.
I think that's refreshing also, because it's a chizuk to people who are watching this conversation, to people who are going to read the book, who are across the world. Sometimes we think that our world, we live in a bubble, and we think it's our block, our shul, our yeshiva, our city, our state. There's a wide world out there with so many yidden and neshamas spread out across the world who could be inspired by that you could reach the pinnacle of Torah greatness and also chesed, living wherever it is. As long as your mission and your goal is so pure, like his was, that's definitely unique.
He encouraged people. If you said to him, he would say often, "Where do you live?" And the guy would say, "I don't know, Passaic, Jackson, or Lakewood, or whatever." He'd say, "Why don't you go to Birmingham?" And or literally, that would be a common conversation. And I don't think there's one in the book. There was one. It's not in the book. One fellow came. He said he went to Memphis. It's not in the book. He said he went to Memphis. And he went to visit Rav Nota, and he had this conversation. He said, "Where do you live?" He said, "I don't Passaic." My father said to him, "Well, why don't you go to New Orleans? Why don't you go to?" And the guy thought. He said, "Oh." The guy wrote. He said. He wrote in this WhatsApp little note. He said, "At least I know how we got stuck in Memphis, because that's how he thinks." You know what I mean? But then the guy said the next day he went to Minyan and they didn't have a Balkari. And he said, "I'm a Balkari, but no one has asked me to lane in 5 years because they have Baruch Hashem, and I had to lane in Memphis. I understood that there could be a role for a person." And I think that my father wasn't telling a person to go to Birmingham or New Orleans or San Antonio because chas v'sholem he felt that a person, if you can sit in Memphis and you can learn and you can be an Eved of Hashem, so why can't every person do that? I mean, I don't know that it's as easy for every other person. You certainly can't counsel a person so easily that way. Right. But he did it, and he felt that a person, there is a Rav from San Antonio, had 4 sons. And he asked my father that he has an opportunity to leave. To go to New York, and he was concerned about his sons. And my son said, "I give you avtacha, you'll have all b'nei Torah." And the Rav has 4 sons, one in the Detroit Kola, one in Lakewood, one is a Rav in Chicago, and one took over the shul in San Antonio. And when my father started his yeshiva at the age of 91, the Rav sent a check of an inordinate amount of more money than a Rav normally could afford to send. He said, "I curse a toy for the bracha." But my father felt if you're Ehrlich and you're Ernst and you're in San Antonio for this, that message will go through to your children, and you'll have B'nai Torah, and but at the end of the day, it's who we are and what we are inside that affects our children. And he felt that this Rav would have this hatzlacha, which he did. So,
would you say, was that did he have this streak of kiruv? Because it didn't come off that way. It wasn't like your father and father-in-law was in kiruv. That's not what he was doing.
I think that every Jew mattered to him. I remember many, many years ago hearing, probably from my mother-in-law, that my father-in-law had flown to Frankfurt, Germany, to give a woman a get. And I remember thinking to myself, there's no rabbanim in Europe that could, write a get for a woman. But that wasn't a cheshbon to him. I think that every Jewish person to him was the same importance, the same kavod, the same weightiness. So if, to my father-in-law, getting on a plane was like you and I getting in a car. I mean, he was a million miler on several different airlines. Yes.
This concern and this willingness to travel. I think it wasn't a suffix even to him. Like it was like, and he didn't ask anybody, didn't tell. He just felt that he had to do it. And it was.
How did your mother deal with his spontaneity of just picking up and going to help people all over? Did it take a toll on her? What did she look at it as a sacrifice?
No, I ask you, what would you say?
I think my mother-in-law is an amazing woman. She is, first of all, an extremely capable person, extremely resourceful. She made a beautiful home, and I think gave her children, everything that they could need. They had nice clothes. They had, she taught them typing. I know she gave them everything. She in a sense is a self-sufficient woman. I'm sure that it was hard when the kids were younger. I can't imagine that it wasn't hard. But when I already knew her, there was a tremendous acceptance of that her husband is doing important things. And, she would answer the phone. She would answer the phone like this. Someone would ask for Rabbi Greenblatt, and she would go, 302-555. And it wasn't his cell number because it was before cell phones. So it was the number of the person that he was staying with in Mississippi or Louisiana or Arkansas or California or Washington State. So she would just be like the secretary, and she would just keep the list of numbers
of where
he was, so that you could catch him if you needed him. But I never heard her complain about it.
Wow. But I know people would call him also at ungodly hours. I mean, they would call him 1, 2 o'clock in the morning with a crisis, and he would pick up the phone.
He would answer the phone. If he was in the middle of a shir at YU and there were 400 boys, or in Ner Yisrael and there were 600 boys, he would answer the phone because he felt that he has nachrayas. Right. And sometimes he would work on getting a get out of a person for 10 years. Right. And if he missed that phone call, he'd miss that opportunity. I think an interesting indication of his love of every Yid was, I don't know if it's in the book or not, but a Moel from Dallas called him that he was was called to do a get, and the fellow was unfortunately a Jew that had already was serving yashka. You understand? He had already a J for J, as we call him, and he asked my father, what should he do? That's a good shaila. You could hear a Rav. And his name is David Shaul, and my father said to him, Davidel, what's this mitai? What's the matter with you? You don't believe in tshuva? A Yid can do tshuva. So, here's there's a perspective there. Here's a person that's, as far as we're concerned, maybe a masis. You know what I mean? Maybe certainly on the opposite of any spectrum that we could define. And in my father's mind, he said, "What says he? You have to do a
He's a
bris. He's a yid, and you have to do a bris, and you don't believe in tshuva." So if that's your perspective, even of the most extreme, this is far more than the Nebuch, the yid that have not had an opportunity to learn or have an education. That was his perspective. I think it says a lot about how we need to look at our brothers and sisters.
Right.
Right. If you would say kiruv rechokim to him, he wouldn't know what you were talking about.
Right, that's what I'm figuring. He didn't, because he was looking. He saw Yidden, and he knew he wanted to impact them and bring. But it wasn't under the umbrella of kiruv.
But the impact that he had on so many, I feel that mostly it wasn't like he was making a concerted effort. It was by virtue of who he was. Like, I mean, much has been already made of the story when he, told Mr. de Brown, to give up his paper route and he'll pay him the $1.50 that he would make. And now there's generations of a mishpacha, but that wasn't a kiruv ploy. That was like, there's Shabbos. Shabbos is worth more than $1.50 a week. So I'll pay the $1.50 a week. It was just who he was. And I think that was so compelling to him. On his last trip to ArtScroll, it was for our oldest granddaughter's wedding. And a couple who now lives in ArtScroll, and who he was Makarev, came to see him. It was like coming to pay homage to their Rebbe. I was there. They were just tears. Like, how do you thank a person for giving you life in this world and life in the next world and doros and generations? They're very reticent people. I don't even know that they were interviewed for the book.
Speaking about that, about people being interviewed and telling their story, so Shmuel Batnick told me something very interesting. He said what was unique about this book, Rav Nota Greenblatt didn't head some large organization that had a big email list you could contact. He had to start doing research, and he started reaching out to Yidden in far-flung places, and he was a man on a mission to dig up Rav Nota's story, which is also an interesting phenomenon, and he couldn't believe some of the people he spoke to, where they were and how somehow your father reached them, and just that also just creates such a unique facet to his life story. Reaching so many people in so many places, disparate people. I'm sure there are people that we didn't get to for this book, and more stories will come in. But
I know there are, because there's almost every day or every other day someone tells me a story. My dad, I just spoke to a Rav Dovid kashrus in Queens. I was talking about some topic, and he said, my father was a rabbi in New Orleans, and I was 6 or 7 years old, and your father was in New Orleans at our house, and I watched him daven Shemona Esrei, and I remember till today, the man is my age, he's not young, and he said, I was blown away at Shemona Esrei the way he davened. I never saw a person so immersed in his tefillah. He's telling me this story 60 years later, and it was part of being in his own world. That Shemona Esrei it didn't matter that it was in New Orleans, it didn't matter you're in Memphis. I told my wife on the way up, my father really never lived in Memphis, he was in his own world, and it didn't, he was in his own world.
When we were first married, I was very young, and I got my first teaching job. And I really didn't know what I was doing at all. And they gave me like a 12th grade class to teach like medieval Jewish literature. And I had to teach the piyutim of Rav Yehuda Halevi. I assure you I did not know them. But I would call my father-in-law at night.
Okay.
And he would teach them to me on the phone.
And he knew it?
No, there was no 2-second delay between, I would just say which piyut it was, and he would, and then I'll never forget, one evening I called him, I said, I really don't understand this at all. And he said, Devira, I have a tune for that one. So he had music to go with the Piyutim of Rav Yehuda Halevi, like, who has that?
No, he was a beautiful chazan, right?
He was a
Yeah.
Baltfila, but
Yeah.
yes, he was a beautiful Baltfila. It was, you know, we knew the Pirush Hamilim, which right away
Right.
is
Gives it a different flavor.
different flavor.
Different flavor.
And he was, being in his own world, made his Yom Kippur be a Yom Kippur, and his Rosh Hashanah, and his Purim and his Tisha B'Av. They were all in his. I was in YU once, and a guy comes over to me and says, "I went to Memphis once. I don't know, some learning program in there," and he said, "I was in your house for Tisha B'Av, and I don't think I ever saw anybody." Cry for the Beis Hamikdash like I saw. This fellow told me. He said, I don't think I ever saw that. And this is in Memphis. So it was in, Rashi's living, the Beis Hamikdash was just destroyed.
Everything was real.
Everything was real. By Kriyas HaTorah, you needed patience because he was watching the conversation between Yitzchak and Yaakov, between Yitzchak and Esav. He's watching it. He's there. And I think if we can do that, if a person, I think it's important to say that I really hesitated to see that there should be a book, because here's a person who's been humble and private his whole life. What right do you have? And I think that the point is that we have to see what we can learn. The point of the book is, and I wrote it in my introduction.
And what do you think that is? What is that?
I think that the point is that every person has to really, as you disconnect from their externalities and from their conformity, and really see what is their real kosher, what is their real relationship to their achrayus, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Torah, to Klal Yisrael, to their brothers and sisters. I think that every person has a responsibility to do that, and that's Hashem is going to ask that of every one of us. I think that's the lesson here, and we have to answer for ourselves. I think it's kedai to have a book. So it's not about watching what someone else did. The question is, how can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How can I, what's the message for me? And I think there's a message for people. I think there's a message for my father was no different than every other person in that regard. He was a regular person.
I would say he was blessed with certain abilities.
He was about Kishran. He was about Kishran, and he had a love of
Would
Torah.
you say he was brilliant? Yes.
I don't
I see
know.
what
I
to say.
wouldn't say I say that about
I mean,
him,
and he had a remarkable memory. He didn't forget.
Remarkable memory, almost to the very end.
Yeah.
The last 8 months of his life or so, we had the privilege of having him live with us in our house. And it was an amazing thing. It was really an amazing thing. I was reflecting and I was thinking that certainly in his own home, it's a very comfortable, welcoming, beautiful home. I don't think that I ever, in all the years, saw him sit on a couch. He sat by the table, he participated in the meals, he had his own study, a little base medrash that they built on to the house, and he'd come in the kitchen, every once in a while to get some very boiling hot water with a little bit of mezainis, as he would say, that my mother-in-law always had a supply of on the counter. But he never just sat around. That wasn't the thing. And I remember thinking a few times over those last months that he was in our home, that when he sat in a chair, like even how he walked and how he sat, even till the end, was, I would call it ramrod straight. And to me, it was almost a representation of like a certain yashrus that was there. He was clear, he was yashar, he was straight in his dealings, and had a clear vision of what his life needed to be. And in a certain sense, that's an amazing blessing. Like, how much time do each of us spend wondering, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I living the life that Hashem wants me to live? But he didn't do that. He somehow early on must have had a very clear vision. When he went to Memphis, is this in the book, David? That when he went to Memphis, he had a lifelong friendship with Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky.
Uh-huh.
And Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky took him to the train, I think it was it the train? When he was going to Memphis for his first job. To Memphis, he was a bacher. He was probably about 26 or so.
No, it was younger.
He was younger?
Yeah,
Okay, a little bit younger.
Yeah.
And Rav Binyamin, who they were friends for their whole lives, said, "I'll pick you up in 2 weeks when they throw you out." But that didn't bother him.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. My father, he didn't talk about, unless you asked him, he didn't. So I once asked him, "Did you ever meet the Chazon Ish?" He said, "Zicher." He said, "I went into his home in Bnei Brak, and this is my father's humor, and this is my father." And he says, so I came in, I sat down in the living room, the Chazon Ish was lying on his couch. He would lie on his couch, probably after, learning for 22 hours. So I said over a Chiddush, and the Chazon Ish said to me, "Nu, das ist dein Chiddush, that's your Chiddush." And my father says to me, "What does he mean that's my Chiddush? The whole Chazon Ish's farm are full with his Chiddushim. Why can't I have one also?" that was just, but it was a story you only got out if you asked. You know what I mean? If you didn't ask, you never. I never heard the story till you asked. But I think that it was a lifetime this way. He told me for his bar mitzvah, he said his father told him when he was 12, he said, "I don't know if we're going to have a bar mitzvah." So my father, "Well, what do you mean? I'm 12, I'm 13. So my Zayda said, a yid needs to know one Masechta Shakla V'Tari, one Masechta needs to know well for a bar mitzvah. So my father said, so I learned Kedushin Gemara Rashi Taisos, he said, because I have my bar mitzvah. That was
Really?
That was, he told me, yeah.
And again, the thing that strikes me is that this is the same person who finished Kedushin Gemara Rashi Taisos by his bar mitzvah, who knew a Welt, who, when it came time to be there for Klal Yisrael, he taught Alf Beis in a cheder.
Yeah, there wasn't.
Which
not only that, he considered.
Would you even hear such a thing? And without getting paid for it.
Right, Rav he considered it a privilege. He didn't. It wasn't like, "Oy vey, I'm stuck here teaching Aleph Beis," like we would say. You know what I mean? I should be teaching. Like most Bnei Torah, I should be teaching the Beis Medrash here, and I'm stuck here in the Aleph Beis here. To him, it was a privilege. To him, it was Torah was Torah, and if you came in and said, "Will you learn with me?" He said, "Whatever you want to learn." He didn't, and you could open up his sefer, and he would pick up sometimes Baal Peh, but Torah was there from Aleph Beis to Olive Nigla. There was no boundary. He could learn with you whatever you wanted. Why would it make a difference? What do you want to learn? And I think it also let him. He was in contact with all the parts of Torah. It was Arba Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. It wasn't just this part or that part, and that was what was remarkable.
Speaking about his learning, I'm just curious because did he have a seder of what he learned? Did he learn Shas? Did he learn Halacha every day? Did he have a seder Hayoim? What?
Because of his privacy, I don't know either.
You don't know?
No.
Because you see, anyone you speak to who was in contact with Rav Nota said he knew Kol HaTorah Kula. He could speak any Masechta, any Sifin Shulchan Aruch. He was comfortable with the Noise Kalim.
I will tell you, in about
a
half a year to a year, I'm going to put out a sefer. He left a lot of Torah. And now I'm seeing already, it's being retyped already. There are a few hundred shticklich Torah there. And they're Torah on topics that, just to start the topic, you have to be an expert in Kosher. Mm-hmm. Just to start, before you begin the topics, the detail and the mastery of the topics, which are not the topics even of a Rav, of a day-to-day job. The tshuvas and the detail is amazing. I mean, 10, 15 pages on topics that we wouldn't know where to start. I'm an average mentor. I mean, I'm sure there are big Talmidei Chacham Baruch Hashem that will. I hope there will be. But his mastery was not, and because he learned everything, was willing to learn everything, and was excited about everything. I think that listening to my father and watching him, there were a few teachers in Klal Yisrael, at least in my own lifetime, that watching them teach was more than what they taught. Just watching their excitement. Rav Kalevsky was one of them, and Chaim Berlin. They had one Rabbi Freifeld used to talk about. But there were when they gave a shir, you watched them rather than just watching their excitement with Torah. My father was that way. You were watching him. And that's important because we need to find a place of Torah that we like and that we love and that we can connect to and it's meaningful to us. There's a message right there, to find our spot and our type of Torah, whatever it is for each person that he wants to tell somebody about, that he's excited about. And I thank ArtScroll for doing this because I want the message to get out and I want Klal Yisrael to grow from it. He would want that. That's really what he would want. He wouldn't want anybody to know about his private life or his humble life or about his stories. And he would say, that's all Narishkeit and what does that matter to anybody? But he would want them to say, what about me? Like, why, if he could go to Memphis, Tennessee and do this, like, where am I,
He was very, very private about his own Yiddishkeit. You could not even ask him, like, did you daven mincha? He would say, it's none of your business.
Oh, really? He would say that?
Yeah.
Yes. So surely chumras and things like that, you would have no. He was very private.
On
like
himself, he took great chumras.
Uh-huh.
My father, if you saw him in Shul and Shabbos, he often had a hat on. Everybody else has a yarmulke on. He has a hat.
You mean when he was wearing his talis?
With his talis and a hat.
With his talis?
A talis,
But
have a
wearing
black
his-
hat on, or whatever his hat was, whatever color it was.
Right. But he wouldn't wear his talis over his head. That's what you mean.
No, it
Where
wasn't.
his hat
The hat would be a hat. And often people are looking at that. Some of the ekkas wear hats, whatever.
Right.
And it's because he didn't have a yarmulke. And why didn't he have a yarmulke? Because he wouldn't, even though he had built Erevin in many cities, he felt there's a chumrah that we can't be samech on an Erev because there are Rishonim that hold that our Rishus HaRabim are real Rishus HaRabim. They're Doraisa, therefore you can't build an Erev. So for his own self, the man who put up the Erevin in many cities would not, and even to the point of
Because he felt if he's wearing a
and
hat, it would
yarmulke
be,
under a
it would be
hat,
carrying
it
a
would be
yarmulke.
so here's a chumrah on a chumrah by a yid that for the world is being makel that no one knows. So they're all asking me, why is your father wearing his hat? What am I supposed to say? He doesn't have a yarmulke. I'm giving an example, but that I didn't know this my whole life. I was wondering myself, and until I finally figured this out. But he wouldn't tell you. So he was machmir on himself, but he was worked hard to permit for others things that were difficult for them. He did not. He wanted to make, that's the obligation of a posek, is to really help people to be able to live a Torah-dika life without giving them things that would be too hard for them. Right. But on himself, he took chumras.
I'll tell you a story. So when we were first married, so I was a new wife setting up a home. Oldest daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, no older sisters, cousins. So there were questions that came up. So I started, of course, to call my new father-in-law. And whatever I asked him, he said, mutter, mutter. And I said, this is great. I have my own personal, lenient rabbi, posek. This is, put him on speed dial. And then a few months after we were married, I called him with a question about if something was allowed on Shabbos. And somebody had told me that such a thing is allowed. I don't know that I should say exactly what it was. But so with great confidence, I picked up the telephone to just sort of verify with my father-in-law that this was in fact allowed. And he said, he was a takif, there was a fire there. And he said, Asher! Like that left no question. And I realized that I hadn't gotten myself my own lenient posek. What I had gotten, what I had the good fortune to marry into, was someone that had complete clarity. So when something was mutter, there's nothing to discuss. But when it was aser, there was also nothing to discuss.
I would watch him. He was in Memphis 70, 80 years. I told my wife in the car, most rabbis after 7 years in Memphis would be playing tennis and golfing. That's what is the city doing? And he would go to bench and get his hat and his jacket, no matter where it is, the same way a young man does when he's 14, 15 at the base. His behavior was no different than it had been, and he's a zokain. It's not even easy to go get a hat and a jacket, but that wasn't even it was part of being in that world. His world was that world, and it didn't matter how old he was, and it didn't matter where he was.
And it didn't matter that there was no one around to be impressed.
At all.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. Shimon Esrei was no different whether he was in the front of the tzibur or whether he was he was in Shayashiv when he was 92 years old, and he stood up for the whole Yom Kippur. They still haven't recovered. The young people haven't recovered. He stood for the entire Yom Kippur.
Wow.
But not, and only if you looked. In other words, if you looked, you realize, he's not sat down. He never sat down. But that was, this is a person in that world of what his obligation was, and it was blessed with Arichas Yomim, probably, as a gift for that. Of course, he said it was because he had a bracha from Rav Kook when he was 7, and I can't take away Rav Kook's bracha, Baruch Hashem. But if actually, in my father's humor, he said Rav Kook he said to my father's father, "No, he should have Arichas Yomim, he should be a big Talmud Chacham," and my father said it was at least half true. Half
Classic.
Classic. That's what you would expect it. The author told me that the hardest part of getting stories from people was that everything that he responded was classic. They knew that. So to the people, this wasn't a story because of course Rav Nota said that. So I don't have a story really because of course he would have said that.
There's so much to unpack about his life, and a lot of that is done in this book.
Great.
And we thank both of you for facilitating this book, because this book would not have happened without your foresight and without your support and your encouragement and asking Shmuel Batnick to undertake this project. And like I told him, I think you've given the world a gift. So. Where the Rebbeinu Shalom gave the world a gift called Rav Nota Greenblatt, but much of the world wasn't zeicha to know him b'chayav, despite the thousands whose lives he touched. And now with this book, we're going to be able to spread that message and inspiration further. And I think because your father and father-in-law was so multifaceted, each person in their own way, young and old, men and women, will be able to glean something, whether it's in his Torah, his avodah, his gemilas chasadim, his humor, his finding the joy in Yiddishkeit, whatever it is that Reb Nota was able to find. The Mirza Hashem will all be able to take from that in our own lives. So any final words before we wrap up?
I do hope that the book is read, and I think that it will appeal to a broad spectrum of our brothers and sisters in Klal Yisrael. I think it has broad appeal. From what I saw, he wrote it beautifully, and I felt that I had a Ben Torah, and I felt this should be written by a Ben Torah, because you needed to have that sensitivity to what my father was. It had to come from a person that understands what Torah is, or it would be lost. And I did want Klal Yisrael to learn from it. The world says it's as a joke, Achrei Mos Kedoshim, that after a person dies, everybody becomes, he becomes holy, And I thought about that, and there's another part to it that's serious, and that is because if a person passes away and then you start looking at his life carefully and you start really saying who was the person, then you can often find Kedusha there. And I think the book is, after his passing, Zechron Livracha, I think it's an opportunity to see where that Kedusha was because of the work that Rav Batnick did, because he spoke to 100 people, and because he did literally a year of research. You can actually see how much was there, and we can see Kedusha, and hopefully we can grow from it and learn from there and grow ourselves.
Amen. Mirza Hashem, he should be a Melitz Yosher.
Amen. Thank you.
For Rabbi Greenblatt, Mrs. Greenblatt, thank you again for
the whole
coming
family.
out.
Thank
It was
you.
a
Thank you for
pleasure
the
to speak to you.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.